Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The civil conflict in Libya reached a hopeful milestone in mid-January with a UN-sponsored agreement on a mechanism for holding elections in late December, 11 months from now. It is a complicated arrangement for an executive council, a presidential trio, and a prime minister, with candidate lists submitted by regions controlled by either a Turkish-supported Tripoli government or an Egyptian-backed Benghazi militia. To break it all down and perhaps put it together again, we would like to welcome from Central Israel Dr. Haim Koren, who is the former Israeli ambassador to Egypt and a lecturer to IDC Herzliya. Thank you for joining us. Also joining us from another location in Central Israel is Dr. Eran Lerman, who is the vice president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and a lecturer at Shalem College, as well as the co-host of TV7's Middle East Review. Thank you for joining us as well.
Good to be with you as always.
Indeed, and with us here in the studio is our TV7 analyst and host of TV7's Watchmen Talk, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, I'd like to immediately dive into this topic as Libya has been, even though marginalized to a certain degree on the diplomatic and political scale, a significant pillar in strategies of other regional actors, which may indicate prospects of a vassal state in the future, or to the contrary, a rogue state. So we would like to somehow explore what is the significance of this country and where are we heading to at this stage.
So Libya is geopolitically situated in a very important place, smack down the middle of the Mediterranean, with oil reserves. Of course, its neighbors, mainly Egypt to the east and Tunisia to the west, are looking for their own strategic interests. And the Middle East in general is now marking the 10th anniversary of the so-called Arab Spring, which started in Tunisia and spread all over. One of the victims of this phenomenon was Muammar Gaddafi, who ruled Libya for 42 years. And in a way, what we have seen in Libya over the last 10 years, since he was toppled, he was later killed in December of 2011, is something similar to what has happened to Iraq. A brutal dictator, Saddam Hussein there, Gaddafi here, very cruel, an iron grip on his country. Everyone outside of the country abhorring him, coming out against him. But once he is gone, the country does not seem to be governable. There are tribal and regional fights, foreign intervention by outside powers such as Iran over there, and here Egypt and Turkey. And in the Libyan case, it seems even more hopeless than in Iraq, because what we have seen is East against West, a sort of a civil war, not the North against the South, such as in the American case, but East against the West, supported by either Egypt in the Haftar case or the National Government Accord being supported by Turkey. And the arrangement which you mentioned regarding the candidate list now has the West, the East, and the South. And you have to add to that not only tribes, but also families, because it seems as if blood, revenge, massacres, you don't see any outside force, be it the United Nations, the European Union, any combination of states, being able to put a lid on the simmering pot here, even if what you described as an outline for some sort of power sharing will come to fruition in the next several months, it will probably not hold.
Unfortunately, there are plenty of blood feuds ongoing and in tribal
Tribal
Arabian
and
society.
clans,
Indeed.
families.
This is always a very big challenge to resolve. I'd like to move to Dr. Lerman. Could you provide us with your perspective on the situation, with a touch, if you will, on the Turkish narrative of things with regard to Libya, which is a very significant stakeholder in what we know as the Government of National Accord in Tripoli, which was initially formed by the United Nations but was shunned by a significant part of Libyans themselves.
Well, the Turks have positioned themselves basically going back to 2014 as the sponsors of what became the GNA. One of the reasons is ideological. Erdogan sees himself as the patron of all Muslim Brotherhood-supported governments in the region, so that extends to Hamas. It extended to Morsi when in the 1 year he held Egypt, and of course, from the point of view of Erdogan, Sisi is a usurper, a dictator, and essentially an illegitimate ruler of Egypt. It extends to the Muslim Brotherhood, or the Justice and Construction Party, as it is called in Western Libya. And so there is an ideological dimension to this intervention, but there's also geostrategy. By intervening in Libya, particularly since late 2019, in the face of Haftar's LNA advances and the siege of Tripoli, the Turks basically extracted, in return for their military support, an agreement with the Sarraj government that delineates the Eastern Mediterranean in a way that can strangle Israel, Egypt, and Cyprus and cut off Greece, if accepted, of course, which it is not, cut off Greece from its Eastern Mediterranean allies. This was a direct response to the emergence of the EMGF as a regional organization. And this map is very dear to the Turks' heart. They are putting immense pressure on people on both sides now that this will not be abandoned in the political agreement that might emerge through the agency of the UN. Stephanie Williams has made some progress, and now the UN finally appointed a negotiator to replace Hassan Salameh after more than a year, or nearly a year. But the Turks are willing to undermine this outcome if it does not include adherence to their map of the Eastern Mediterranean. So Libya is by now becoming the playground of Erdogan's neo-Ottoman ambitions. It's becoming more and more complicated because by now there are factions within the GNA that want to deal, and apparently the Egyptians have reached out to them. And there are also tensions on the LNA side between Haftar and the chairman of the House of Representatives, Saleh Hakela. So it's becoming more and more an internal game in both Tripoli and Benghazi, which the Turks may use to undermine any agreement, any arrangement that doesn't fit their plans, but they could also end up being the losing side. Mm-hmm. Much of this depends on how firmly and decisively the new American administration moves in to curb Turkish ambitions. That is a very important issue. They did very little in that direction.
Even though the Russians are also involved, of course, there are Russian mercenaries currently involved on the behest of Haftar and the LNA, the Libyan National Army, which has produced some interesting statements from AFRICOM, the African Command of the U.S. military, which actually, even though officially stating itself as neutral within the conflict, it led it into siding more and more with the GNA, where the Turks were involved in. So it seemed very complex at that stage. But just for the sake of our viewers, Dr. Lerman mentioned, of course, the MGF, which is the East Mediterranean Gas Forum. Israel is part of that. Egypt is part of that. Greece and many other countries. The key challenge on the legal aspect of things was indeed the EEZ agreement between Libya and Turkey, which was not accepted by anyone in the region, to say the least, except for Turkey. But I'd like to move to Ambassador Koren with regard to the Egyptian narrative of things. How do you see the Egyptian involvement also putting clear red lines to the Turks with regard to their involvement in Libya, allocating its major divisions of its military to be able to invade Libya in case that the Turkish military does not acquiesce to its request? There are a lot of different forces here at play and a lot of implications. How do you see that?
A problem of a failed state like Libya, it's not only international, but first and foremost domestic. It's not only the struggle of power between Prime Minister Sarraj and Haftar, but also tribal local militias and some other players that coming from outside playing within Libya. That weakness causes not only to Turkey to work for its own interest, specifically on energy, and trying to shape a new border on the sea in order to promote Turkish interest, but also some other countries to be heavily involved in Libya, such as the Emirates, such as Egypt, and so on. And Egypt shares a 2,000 kilometers border with Libya. That means that Libya becomes, or it's already a very important component to many countries within the region. If you would like to join Russia to this game, that Russia, the Emirates, Egypt works with Turkey with Egypt against Libya, with Haftar in Libya against Sarraj. So Turkey trying to put the equation in a different point. Now, since everybody is involved in Libya so many years from the beginning of this Arab Spring, trying to promote any kind of solution, unsuccessfully yet, even the UN nominated Meldanov, who was a special envoy to the Middle East, and then he regretted and left the nomination for the Slovakian envoy. It shows how difficult it is to bring together all the interest, all the contradictory interest of outsider players into this framework, trying to solve it. The fact that we're talking about 2021 as a kind of a deadline for creating some political or framework or something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen or it will bring some come out of it. Now, the issue is that in our era that we're talking about the creature called frenemy, there are countries that they have common interests with some other countries in Libya and contradictory interest with other countries within Libya. So it means that it makes the situation very difficult to be solved. And we need to find a new constellation. Maybe the new administration in the US will shape a new policy in the Eastern Mediterranean and try to promote any kind of solution that we didn't see in the last few years.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, I'd like to ask you three angles to this issue. The first one, Ambassador Koren mentioned, of course, Nikolai Mladenov, the former UN Mideast envoy or envoy for Mideast peace, who headed the UN section within the quartet and was in charge of advancing talks between Israelis and Palestinians, even though his main role was actually assuring that the conflict is subdued to a certain degree, fighting has subsided, back-channeling with Hamas and Israel and such, rather than advancing diplomatic issues other than actually just establishing statements after statements that it should happen. Is this something that we can also expect now in Libya, rather than resolving the conflict to see somebody in charge of assuring that both sides won't fight each other? And then we have the other element of things that we hear from both Ambassador Koren and Dr. Lerman, is the Turkish side and the Egyptian side in this whole question, with Greece, of course, being also a big factor here. Now, Europe has, of course, a lot of interest in Libya as well. We have the EU mandated mission under UN Security Council resolutions called Irini, a naval mission to thwart the smuggling of weapons from third countries into Libya. Ironically enough, it's called Irini, which means in Greek peace, but this may, of course, signal to Turkey that in order to achieve peace, Turkey needs to be subdued when it comes to smuggling weapons into Libya. And to what degree is that a factor in this whole picture? And then the third element, is the Biden administration keen on rekindling a issue that has been a point of much contention for the Democratic Party under the Obama administration?
So the question can be asked, is Libya a superficial state? It has, of course, been a joint venture of Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. The Italians, who are the closest to Libya, ruled it until World War II, and then the British and mostly the Americans, because of Willis Air Base, a strategic Air Force base needed for World War III, they ruled it with King Idris until the revolution, until the Gaddafi revolution, which really put Libya on the map. It was a backward country until then. Its oil reserves were not put to use, and only since the late 60s or early 70s has it been a player. Now, Joe Biden, as the vice president in the Obama administration, was part of Operation Odyssey Dawn against Gaddafi 10 years ago, and much the way you saw him in the Situation Room when bin Laden was killed. You could have seen him in such situations also vis-a-vis Libya. So this is his formative experience. But is it a top priority for him? One does not get the sense that Libya is anywhere near the 10 or 20 first items on his list. One other lesson that you can see being applied from Iraq to Libya is co-opting the militias. Because you cannot really fight the militias, you offer them to join the military, you try to train them and perhaps get them to serve under the government. They just started it. Only a few weeks ago, they started this experiment. Whether it will work, whether we are finally going to see a federal state of Libya or some sort of power sharing, one should not get overly optimistic.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman, where are we heading from here at a time when UN-led negotiations are seemingly producing fruit? There are, of course, the talks ongoing, the 13 plus 13 mill-to-mill talks in Morocco under the auspices of the King, Mohammed VI. How do you see all of this evolve in a place where the biggest losers of the situation are going to be the local residents of that country who ultimately are going to be put between the rock and the hard place when we're talking about regional battles of power.
Well, I'm not entirely pessimistic, and I'll tell you why. At some point, let's say in the summer of 2020, an equilibrium had been reached, had been established. The Turks helped the GNA push the overextended forces of Haftar away from Tripoli, away from most of northwestern Libya. But when they started pushing further and further east, the Egyptians put a red line, an implementable red line, in the Jaffa-Sirte line, more or less central, in the heart and middle of right in the middle of Libya, and basically said, if you cross that line, we're coming in. And as they say in Texas, a loaded gun beats 4 aces, and 12 armored divisions beat a ragtag collection of Syrian proxy militias sent by by Turkey, and even the Bayraktars of Turkey cannot be a match for Egyptian F-16s and Apaches. So this basically put an end to the prospect of a decisive battle. It also made Haftar less relevant, and it makes the Turks less relevant. It creates an opportunity for some kind of political arrangement that will sustain this equilibrium. But this must be backed by a robust Egyptian presence over the horizon and an American determination to cut Turkey down to size, to resolve this issue of the Eastern Mediterranean delineation and limit Erdogan's ambitions. If that is done as the core of Biden's policy in the Mediterranean, with the French and the Americans working together instead of at cross purposes, with Italy throwing finally a line also Haftar's side, because Conte and Di Maio went to Rajma in December to meet with Haftar. So finally Italy is also coming on board in the effort to create bridges between the two sides. Maybe there's a chance that what the carnage that we saw in the first half of 2020 will not repeat itself.
Ambassador Koren, your perspective on this, and really from a domestic point of view, we spoke time and again about the fact that Libya is very tribal and very clan-oriented, very family-minded, Arabian culture / African influences on the culture, of course. But we have a western part under the control of the GNA with Turkish strings being pulled in order to assure its interests in that country. Then we have the eastern part, which is under the LNA, with the Egyptian strings and other strings attached to that, of course. And then we have the southern lawless string, where we have jihadist militants, Islamic State, the various jihadist organizations operating there, of course, with influences from Boko Haram and other organizations very active. Is the international community in a state currently where it can resolve such a complex issue?
It's a matter of process, but in the first place, it's a matter of decision. Now, if the coming American administration will reassess its policy towards Turkey, for example, and of course, arranging the relationship with Russia, and looking at Egypt and a several eye, and acknowledging the new reality that have been established in the region in the last 4 years, I'm also not pessimistic, because there is a possibility of arrangements due to the interest of all sides, namely, if Erdogan will be put on its real place and will, unlike it was actually shown in Trump administration. And as Abdel Fattah al-Sisi put the red line, as Dr. Lerman mentioned before, within Libya. And the determined decision to fight terrorism, namely Boko Haram, those militias within Libya, closing the borders, for example, from Central African Republic to Boko Haram to climb up to Libya, or from Sudan, closing the border from Al-Shabaab or some other militant groups to penetrate into Libya, as well as France will do its own efforts to prevent Haim and other powers coming from Mali back to Libya. Maybe some determination and control on terrorism, and of course, first and foremost, cooperation between those countries will start to build some kind of trust and some kind of structure that they can go on from there.
Ambassador Koren, unfortunately, this is all that the time that we have accumulated for each answer. So I'd like a closing sentence from you, Mr. Oren. All it comes down to is political will. Is there currently political will in one sentence?
So your question is the GNA versus the LNA, but what is the DNA of Libya? There is some political will, but let's say just a word about Israel's interest. Israel doesn't want Libya to become an arms depot for Gaza, for Hamas, and it doesn't want Egypt to be distracted.
Indeed, and it will scrutinize this area in order to assure its national security interests kept. I'd like to thank Dr. Eran Lerman, Ambassador Haim Koren, and Mr. Amir Oren for being part of today's discussion. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.